Let's read from Matthew chapter 17 to begin this morning. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and the two brothers, James and John, and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed so that his face shone like the sun and his clothes became as white as light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Lord, it's wonderful for us to be here. If you want, I'll make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved Son, who brings me great joy. Listen to him." The disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Then Jesus came over and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. As they went back down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." Then his disciples asked him, "Why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes?" Jesus replied, "Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. But I tell you, Elijah has already come. But he wasn't recognized, and they chose to abuse him. And in the same way, they will also make the Son of Man suffer." Then the disciples realized he was talking about John the Baptist. At the foot of the mountain, a large crowd was waiting for them. A man came and knelt before Jesus and said, "Lord, have mercy on my son. He has seizures and suffers terribly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they couldn't heal him." Jesus said, "You faithless and corrupt people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." Then Jesus rebuked the demon in the boy, and it left him. From that moment, the boy was well. Afterward, the disciples asked Jesus privately, "Why couldn't we cast out that demon?" "You don't have enough faith," Jesus told them. "I tell you the truth. If you had faith even as small as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it would move. Nothing would be impossible." What an amazing story, right? An amazing story of the glory of God showing up in this moment on earth, in Jesus, on this mountain, in front of these disciples. I mean, it's just such an extravagant and amazing story. And there are 2 ways that I want to kind of look at it and analyze it a bit. And the first is by looking back. I want to look back at Moses and Elijah to begin with. Because I think by looking back, it helps us understand what's happening in this moment. And then here in a few moments, we're going to look forward to what's to come. I think that also helps us understand this moment of transfiguration. So when we think about Moses and Elijah here, I think there are a couple of ways that we might understand what's going on to think about with these 2 figures showing up. And the first is simply to talk about Moses and Elijah and who they were, the positions that they held in Israelite religious society. Why were these 2 people so important? Because it's no doubt that Moses and Elijah were held in incredibly high regard. The Israelites esteemed them very highly, and not least for their great accomplishments in life. Moses, we know, was a great teacher, right? It was to him that God chose to present the law, so that Moses could then instruct the people, here is how to live, to be holy like your God is holy. Moses, a great teacher, also a great leader. It was Moses that God chose to send back to Egypt so that his people could be led through the wilderness. Not for as long as they were wandered, but so that they could eventually reach the promised land. Moses is described as a true servant of the Lord. Moses, a great, great man. What about Elijah? Elijah was a great prophet. He performed all kinds of miracles. We see those. You go back and you read in Kings, you see the miracles ascribed to Elijah. the way that he wandered around and helped the people very much resembles Jesus. We see Jesus in Elijah in a lot of ways. He's somebody who constantly pointed the Israelites back to the Lord. Elijah never made it about himself. It was never about how great he was. It wasn't about the kind of miracles that he performed. At all times, Elijah worked for the Lord. I think the connections to Jesus here ought to be immediately perceptible to us. But also, Moses and Elijah in Israelite history went on to represent, these two names went on to represent what I believe are the two pillars, really, of Israelite faith: the law and the prophets. We even see Jesus talk about the law and the prophets whenever he speaks to the people. He says, the greatest command, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second, like it, love your neighbor as yourself, does what? Sums up the law and the prophets. When he gives them the golden rule that you should do to other people what you want done to you, he says this rule sums up the law and the prophets. Moses and Elijah represent those two pillars of faith, the law and the prophets. So the appearance of these two men with Jesus in this moment, on this mountain, represents, since Jesus is greater than both of them. Matthew has been trying to tell us that all along. Jesus is greater than Moses. He is a new Moses. He's better. He's better than we've ever had before. That in this man, this Messiah, the law and the prophets find their fulfillment. And that also, that this man, this Messiah, this Jesus, is the one to whom the law and the prophets were pointing all along. Just on Wednesday nights, we just finished, I just spent like almost a year going through the prophecies of the Messiah in the Old Testament. So everybody who's been there can attest. There are a bunch of them. Yes, there are a bunch of them. All of those are pointing to this man, Jesus. Moses and Elijah showing up are a testament to that fact. We're here to confirm this is the one who was promised all along. The second way to think about this moment, specifically with regard to Moses and Elijah, is to think about the messianic expectations of the Israelites. What did they believe was supposed to happen prior to ushering in this new age, this messianic age where the Messiah is supposed to rule and be in charge? Now, it would take weeks of discussion for us to talk about that. Let me give you just something very brief here. Because really the truth is the Israelites they didn't think monolithically. There wasn't just one thought amongst all the Israelites at the time. Now, there were some pretty dominant thoughts, but we even see in the Gospels, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they agreed on a lot, but they were very divergent on a lot of ideas and issues as well. They didn't think the same way on everything about their faith. It would be a disservice to say that there's only one way that the Israelites expected the Messiah to show up, because that certainly isn't the truth. But there was one thing in particular with regard to this that they pretty much all agreed on, and that is that Elijah had to show up prior to the Messiah. So in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, we read this statement. Malachi, quoting the Lord, says, "Look, I am sending you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord arrives. His preaching will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. Otherwise, I will come and strike the land with a curse." And so these verses from Malachi were quickly seized upon by the Israelites of, okay, we need to expect Elijah to show up before this great and terrible day of the Lord arrives. Jesus agrees with that. And he says it already happened in the person John the Baptist. It's no surprise that when we go back and read about John the Baptist, he even sounds like Elijah whenever he speaks. His description sounds like Elijah. And the clothes that he wore and the food that he ate, the way that he lived his life, very much sounds like Elijah. And Jesus here is pointing to John the Baptist as that Elijah to come. There were also some who believed that Moses needed to show up again before the Messiah came. Deuteronomy 18, if you want to look there real quick. In Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 19, we see this prophecy. Now, I believe this prophecy to be about Jesus, but there were some in Israel who thought maybe this is pointing to a new Moses. Moses is going to show back up. Verses 15 through 18, Moses continued, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. For this is what you yourselves requested of the Lord, your God, when you assembled at Mount Sinai. You said, 'Don't let us hear the voice of the Lord our God anymore, or see this blazing fire, for we will die.' Then the Lord said to me, 'What they have said is right. I will raise up a prophet like you from among their fellow Israelites. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell the people everything I command him. I will personally deal with anyone who will not listen to the messages the prophet proclaims on my behalf.'" It's no surprise. It's not a shock that Moses and Elijah show up in this moment, but we have to understand how important they are to Israel to catch the weight, the gravity here of their appearance. But also looking back, we can connect this to Moses on Mount Sinai and also to the cloud. Did you catch the description of the cloud coming down, the bright cloud coming down on top of the mountain? That probably struck a chord with you. If you've ever read parts of the Old Testament or read through the Old Testament before, you go, "Oh yeah, that shows up a whole lot in the Old Testament." And you're right, it does. So how does this connect? Well, if you think back to the moment when Moses went up on Mount Sinai in Exodus 24 and then in 33 and 34, we have a lot of details that overlap. Both of these stories, the one that we read just now, the Transfiguration, but also the story of Moses on Mount Sinai, a reference to 6 days is mentioned. Okay, there's one connection. In both, a cloud envelops or covers the mountain in which a great event is happening. All right, there's something else. In both, 3 companions travel with the one who is about to be transformed. Moses takes along 3 people, so does Jesus. In both, God's voice is heard from the cloud. God speaks from this cloud on the mountain. In both, there is a transformed appearance of the main character. If you go back and you look at Exodus, what happens to Moses' face when he meets with God on the mountain? It begins to shine. He's transformed. Well, what happens to Jesus in this moment? He shines like the sun. His clothes become bright white. And then in both, we see a reaction of fear and awe. The people, the Israelite people at the base of Mount Sinai, immediately become afraid. And as we just read in Deuteronomy 18, God says, hey, remember when they said, we don't want to hear from God anymore? That's what happened. They were afraid. What did the disciples say as they come down? They react in fear. Jesus says, do not be afraid. But then there's also a lot of connection here specifically with the cloud. Way too much for me to go into. Just a few comments about that. Obviously, the cloud was there on Mount Sinai. We just talked about that. The cloud also led the people during their time in the wilderness. The presence of God going before the people, leading them to where they needed to be. The cloud arrived at the dedication of the temple, of Solomon's temple. The cloud filled the temple. We have that description, that the cloud filled the temple and came and dwelt there, God's presence arriving in his home. The cloud is described as leaving the temple in Ezekiel chapter 10. He has this vision. He's all the way in Babylon, but he has this vision back to the temple, and he sees the cloud physically get up from the temple and exit and move off. A description of what's about to happen, that God's presence is vacating this space. I don't think there can be any doubt then that James, Peter, John, and obviously Jesus are going to connect all these moments, all these stories that they have grown up and know firsthand, or not firsthand, but know very intimately and deeply. They're going to make this immediate connection. God's presence is here with us on this mountain. So that's looking back. Let's look forward. to the cross. The Transfiguration heralds Jesus' death. So this moment and the moment of Jesus' death on the cross have immediate connections and parallels, and I'm about to point those out to you. But it's interesting because these two moments are really more of a yin and yang. They go together, but they're also in opposition in their descriptions in ways. So the moment of Moses on Mount Sinai, this moment with Jesus is almost a parallel copy of that in some ways. Jesus' moment on the cross is as well, but in a reverse. So what we see on the cross, what we see in the Transfiguration, Jesus' clothes become white and bright, right? When he's on the cross, what happens with his clothing? The soldiers gamble for his clothing, right? He's no longer wearing them. They're no longer bright. They're no longer something to behold as glorious. Here, in this moment on the mountain of Transfiguration, there are witnesses to this great event. 3 of his male disciples at the cross. There are witnesses, but who were the majority witnesses of his disciples? Women. What have happened to the men? They've all run off. They're afraid, right? They're afraid in this moment. Here, they're standing tall and strong, but there, they're afraid. 2 men show up with him both times. In this moment, on the Mount of Transfiguration, it's 2 great heroes of faith, Moses and Elijah. 2 men to be admired. 2 men that all the Israelites looked to and said, that's who we want to be. If we should copy anybody to be like in our faith, it's Moses and Elijah. Who appears with Jesus on the cross? He's flanked by 2 rebels, 2 thieves, 2 men who deserved death, a cruel death at that. Here, Peter exclaims his support for Jesus, right? Hey, this is great. Let's build shelters for you guys. That'll be great, right? What happens to Peter? The cross. He flees. He's stunned into silence, right? He has no more words to speak. Here on the mountain, a bright cloud covers the mountain. The presence of God, the glory of God shows up. When Jesus is crucified, darkness covers the land. Not brightness, but darkness, because the world has lost something precious. Here in this moment, God shows up and says, "This is my son. I'm pleased with him. Listen to what he has to say." On the cross, God is silent. He has nothing to say in that moment. But a Roman soldier declares that Jesus is God's son. These details are important. Because while this is a glorious, amazing moment to behold of Jesus on this mountain, it also immediately points us forward to the cross, a time of despair and darkness, a time when the world is going to lose the thing most precious to it, the Son of God. So we behold this moment in glory and praise God. And we also look forward and say, something terrible is on its way. So what does this story have to teach us? Just a few things. I think one thing we need to understand is that the gospel writers, often people try to paint the gospel writers as they're just telling stories about a nice guy. He's just a nice guy, Jesus. He just wanders around helping people, and that's good, right? Jesus is a nice guy. I don't want to say that Jesus isn't nice. He tends to be pretty friendly and nice to the people around him. But if that's the only understanding you get from reading the Gospels, then you haven't read the Gospels. That's not the person that Matthew is trying to present to you. Matthew is trying to say, this one is special. This isn't just a nice teacher, a nice miracle worker wandering around helping people out. He does do that. This is the Son of God. This is the Son of God. We also learn here that Jesus is the glorious Lord, before whom all are going to bow, even Moses and Elijah, these 2 heroes of faith. are nothing when you compare them with Jesus. Another thing is that God calls the disciples to heed the words of Jesus, the same as he told the Israelites to heed the words that Moses passed on to them from him. In other words, he's saying, this man, Jesus, speaks with my authority. He speaks because I've given him the words to say. Listen to him. Heed his words. It becomes an incredibly important thing for us to listen to. Additionally, though, another takeaway, God's way is the way of death. The way of the cross isn't a way to wearing some cute jewelry, I got a ring that has a cross on it. I like this. I've had it since I was, 16. So I've had it for almost 20 years. I've worn it on my finger. It's my reminder every day. I get to look at it. Some people have wondered why I don't wear it the other way, to show other people the cross, because I'm not there to remind them. I need the reminder for me that this is what I'm about. But this is a torture device. The cross isn't cute jewelry. It's the way of death. When Jesus says, deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me, as he does in chapter 16, that's a call to death. That's a hard calling. That's a really, really hard calling. So if we're going to follow Jesus, we have to be prepared to die. And then finally, I've always loved going to camp. Anybody go to church camp growing up? Or do fun, do fun church things? And what happens when you go to church camp, or you go on a retreat, or you go to some churchy thing? You feel good, right? You feel really good. And you're like, I'm going to go home and tackle the world. I'm going to go convert all my friends. They're all going to come to church with me all the time, and nobody's going to tell me no, and I'm going to kick Satan in the pants, and he's going to be gone, right? You're like on fire, right? Everything's great. Then you go home, and what happens? Bam! The real world shows up, right? And you stop praying, and you stop reading your Bible like you promised you were going to do, and you don't hang out with your church friends as much. You go back to your old friends. Anybody connecting with what I'm saying there? We've got to come off the mountaintop. And I think sometimes we delude ourselves and we hurt ourselves by thinking we can just stay up on the mountain all the time. But what did even Jesus have to do? He had to come down off this mountain. What is he confronted with at the very moment he comes off of there's no greater high than what Jesus had. You can't experience a spiritual high greater than shining like the sun, God's glory showing up all around you, Moses and Elijah coming back and standing with you, proclaiming, this is the guy. And then Jesus has to come down and what? Oh, God, faith, come on. Lack of faith over and over again. He's frustrated. Do you see it in the story? How he's frustrated? How long do I have to put up with you? Jesus had to come off that high. He had to come down off the mountain. Not to stretch the metaphor too far, but just like a real physical mountain that you can climb, if you get up above tree line, you can't live up there. There's no food. There's no shelter. There's very little water. You can't live on the mountain. Spiritually, I think the same is true. If you expect for your life spiritually to be this mountaintop high experience all the time, that's the only way that you can be sustained spiritually, is if you're on a spiritual high, then you're going to be disappointed. That's not life. That's not how it works. But I would also argue that's not where the fight is. That's not where you're needed. You're not needed on top of the mountain. You're needed in the valley. You're needed where people are hurting. You're needed where people are hungry and they're sick and they're tired and they're frustrated and they're spiritually bereft. You're needed in the valley. And if you try to stay on the mountain all the time, that's not where God needs you, and it's unsustainable. You can't live there. Even spiritually, it just won't happen. So come off the mountain. Join the fight in the valley where God is actually asking for you to be and needing for you to be. It's okay not to be on a spiritual high all the time. Don't think that you need to be. All right. I got in a little preacher mode there at the end. I went off script a little bit, which is good. I'm good. I don't know, I felt good during that. All right, let's close. A couple of things. First, do you believe that Jesus really is God's Son and that he represents the way to be truly, truly human? Jesus isn't, I think sometimes we just think that Jesus is just about getting us to heaven. The purpose of following Jesus is that you're changed now. That you're changed into the new humanity right now. That the way that you live is different because of him. Not just when we die and we're in heaven, but right now. Do we believe that Jesus is truly representing the best way to live as a human being? And if we are, or if we do believe that, are we changed by it? And then the final thing to leave you with, are you sure enough in your faith to come down off the mountain? I've already told you you can't live there. So in some sense, this question is like, well, you better get there, because you got to come down. Don't try to stay there. If you're on a spiritual high right now, get off the mountain, get into the valley and fight. Get the work done that you need to get done. And then, whenever you need to get back on that spiritual high, remove yourself and do that. Jesus did that. That's what we see Jesus doing often in his ministry, right? He's down in the fight. He's in the valley working with the people. And he's like, okay, I got to go off and be alone. I got to recharge. I got to get that spiritual high back so that he can come back and do what he needs to do. Up and down is okay. We often think the up and down roller coaster way of spirituality, that's not okay. Like we just got to constantly be doing this. That's not how it works. This is okay. But you got to do it in a sustainable way for you. All right, the moment of transfiguration. Moses and Elijah aren't going to show up behind me today. You're just going to have to trust me. The good news for today is that Jesus is Lord. In this moment, we see Jesus as he's truly meant to be seen, beheld in all of his glory, shining like the sun, and the radiance and the glory of God. The cloud shows up and says, "This is my Son." Good news? Amen? It's good news. The good news is for you today. And if you need something from this church, prayers, love, hugs, kisses, I'm not going to kiss you, but somebody else may. Whatever it is you may need, that's what we're here for. We want to offer that to you. And we have that time as we stand and sing.